So what I'm attempting to do over these actually 14 days, we've got 87 sessions and about 7,000 participants of different flavors, is to raise awareness of the contribution of science to the SDGs. That's the basic foundational objective. It sounds simplistic, but actually it's very, very comprehensive. It's quite sophisticated, and it still needs to be done. If you look at the agenda for the General Assembly taking place over these 2 weeks, you see no science. That's a tremendous shame, oversight, but of course it's equally a tremendous opportunity. So I suppose really just by way of a minor introduction here, so we want to build engagement with policymakers. We want to have an established agenda for science at the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, every year. And certainly so far into these meetings over the last week or so, tremendous ideas. We've had tremendous inputs, and Stefano, we had the honor to listen to him at the opening plenary. And I think not only provided wonderful ideas, but I think what is also equally important is inspiration and encouragement. And we want to translate that into policy options. We want to translate it into priorities. And also we want to recognize really that we live in actually quite a fragmented world in terms of policy, in terms of regulation, in terms of science funding. But of course, the challenges we face, they're not fragmented, they're coherent, they're global, and they're up and at it. So how do we address that? So I think that's a very new agenda. I think we have to rethink the way science is done in all senses of that word. And I think I think it's a huge and wonderful opportunity. And I think the time has come. And certainly the responses we've had over the last period from multilateral fora have been very, very encouraging. And on multilateral fora, we're seeing the G7s and the G20s and the UNs and the EU-Africa summits and the ASEAN summits. And basically, they're all driving the same stuff. And I think science has a common message to all of them. So when I mean we're advancing a multilateral agenda, I mean we're advancing a multilateral agenda into multilateral institutions. And the differences between them are much reduced, again, all on the same program. So listen, a wonderful welcome. We're looking forward to the discussions, looking forward to take this conversation forward in many ways, and we'll be following up on that. So you're very welcome. Thanks again, and thanks to Stefano. Hannah, over to you.
Thank you, Declan. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start the panel with a few slides to address some of the niche areas related to science that apply to microbial sciences, and the need that we have to consider this as we think about global aspects of sustainability. And I need to start thanking Declan and all the colleagues at Intelligence in Science for organizing this meeting. What a pleasure it is to be here and have the opportunity to talk about microbes. And also Stefano Bertuzzi, this is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Society for Microbiology, who really set up this panel and helped us get it organized to ensure that we get most out of it. The goal that we have in this panel is really to raise awareness of the role and contribution of microbial science to the attainment of the United Nations Sustainable Developmental Goals. We can't cover everything, but we have a selected group of panelists that are going to really give a special emphasis on some of the most important aspects, looking at challenges, but also at solutions and opportunities thanks to studying microbes. And I think there is no better way to show you the need that we have to advance microbial sciences for sustainability. We are changing our planet. We have been doing it for a long time. I want to send a message of hope that there are so many microbes. They have been dealing with all planetary changes for so long, for billions of years, that what's something that always amazes me is that they figure out a way to adapt. And when they adapt to all the changes that we're introducing in our planet, they actually even manage to grow. And learning about how they grow is very important because the collective activities of these microbes are actually transforming the earth. So the question that I pose to you And what can we learn from these microbes? Because by learning, we can actually harness the activities and we can make sure that those transformations address sustainability issues. With that, just a brief introduction about who I am. My name is Gemma Reguera. I'm a professor of microbiology and molecular genetics at Michigan State University. I'll be your moderator. Today, I'm very interested in critical aspects of microbial sustainability. Work in my lab actually focuses on a variety of organisms, understanding their diversity, how they live with the impacts that we cause to the environment, both in aquatic and terrestrial environments. I'm very interested also in developing technologies that harvest those microbial processes for water and sanitation, but also for affordable and clean energy. I'm also the editor-in-chief of Applied and Environmental Microbiology, a flagship journal of the American Society for Microbiology. We cover all these topics related to sustainability, and it's a great platform also to address other issues related to health, looking at humans as just another environment, but also equality, to give a platform to all, so we are all represented. And we are a global community of international editors, reviewers, and authors. Gender equality is a big focus of all my research and service as well. It is a pleasure to introduce the first of our panelists, Dr. Arturo Casadevall. He's the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor and Alfred and Jill Sommer Chair of the Molecular Microbiology and Immunology at Johns Hopkins Bloomer School of Public Health. He's editor-in-chief of MBio, a very important journal in Academy of Microbiology. He's also deputy editor of the Journal of Clinical Investigation and serves on several editorial boards. He's a prolific researcher with primary interest in fungal pathogenesis and the mechanisms of antibody action. His work has been recognized with fellowship in several prestigious societies, such as the American Society for Clinical Investigation, American Academy of Physicians, American Academy of Microbiology, American Academy for the Advancement of Science, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and National Academy of Medicine. And I'm mentioning just some of them. Great to have you here, Arturo. He's going to focus. I'm going to present all the speakers, and then I'll introduce each of you. I just want to briefly mention that he's going to really focus his discussion on health, understanding the bad microbes, which is something that we're familiar with, but also looking at the opportunities with the good microbes that can really help us address health inequalities as well. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Jo Handelsman. She is the director of the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Villa Research Professor, and Howard Hughes Medical Institute Professor. She's a prolific and distinguished microbial ecologist who has led groundbreaking studies in microbial communication and pioneered DNA sequence-based approaches called metagenomics to describe the biodiversity and functionality of very complex microbial communities. She served as a science advisor to President Barack Obama and is a fellow of the American Academy of Microbiology and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's also well known for her scholarship on science education, mentorship, and gender advocacy. These efforts were recognized in 2011 with a Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Engineering Mentoring. And she will focus her discussion on the roles of microbes in food production, a very, very important topic. Our next speaker is Dr. Tim Donahue. He is Baldwin and University of Wisconsin Foundation Fetzer Bascom Professor of Bacteriology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's an international expert on the sustainable bio-based conversion of renewables resources into fuels and products. Since 2007, he has led Great Lakes Bioenergy, a U.S. Department of Energy Renewable Fuels and Chemicals Research Center. He's also director of the Wisconsin Energy Institute and interdisciplinary research that seeks to develop new low-carbon technologies. Dr. Donahue will describe the opportunities and challenges of meeting society's growing needs for low-carbon products and highlight the central role of microbes in generating environmentally and economically sustainable strategies for the future. And our last speaker will be Dr. Gretchen Diaz-Munoz. She's the director of the Science Education Program and Community Partnerships of the nonprofit Ciencia Puerto Rico. She's a microbial scientist, educator, communicator, and advocate of diversity and inclusion in the careers of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, what we refer to usually as STEM, especially women and girls. And she's also an at-large board director of the American Society for Microbiology and is the interim committee chair of the Inclusive Diversity with Equity, Access and Accountability Initiative. For her efforts and trajectory, she was recognized by the American Association for the Advancement of Science as one of their if-then ambassadors with the purpose of motivating the next generation of pioneers in STEM. I'm delighted to have her in the panel to discuss why equity should be the driver of all our efforts in microbial science. With that, we're going to focus on some of the major sustainability developmental goals of the United Nations. Our objective really is to emphasize the global aspect of microbial science and the impact that this can have on global policy making and developing partnerships to achieve all these goals. Just a little housekeeping issues. We'll be monitoring the questions. Each speaker will have 10 minutes, and I will raise my hand at the 8-minute mark. We will have all the questions in the chat. If there is time, I may get some questions in between the speakers, but most of the answers will come at the end. Feel free to also raise your hand if you have questions. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome our first panelist, Dr. Arturo Casadevall. Arturo, whenever you are ready.
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you. A very nice introduction. And thank you for having me here. As the one infectious disease physician in the panel, I've been tasked to talk to you about microbes in health and disease. Now, living through the COVID-19 pandemic, don't think that microbes as causes of calamity need any introduction. Certainly, by the way, when I speak about microbes, I mean microscopic life. That includes bacteria, fungi, viruses, and protozoans. To put this story in perspective, it's important to remember that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and that life arose very early, about 3.7 billion years ago. But that large animals, any animals, are relatively recent. For most of life on Earth, for most of Earth history, life has been microbial life. So things like infectious diseases are relatively recent. Now, for us humans, infectious diseases has been the major cause of death in history. And it was that way primarily until the germ theory disease. The germ theory disease occurs in the late 19th century, and it is one of those transformative times in human history. In a period of about 30 or 40 years, many diseases were associated with microbes. And that specific association allowed the development of vaccines, sanitation, and ways of controlling them. Consequently, mortality dropped rapidly. To put it in perspective, had this not happened, 1/3 of the people on this call would not be here today. They would have died before the age of 5. So the germ theory disease is a transformative moment in human history that it gives us the modern world that we know. For most of this time, however, there have been some diseases. As you know, with COVID, we continue to suffer attacks from nature. There have been multiple pandemics in the 20th century, including influenza, HIV, and now the coronaviruses. But the point that I want to point is that despite the successes in controlling infectious diseases, we still have major killers in the form of tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV, or diseases for which vaccines have not been possible. So what you find today is that humanity continues to be plagued by infectious diseases. And I believe that we'll get over COVID and it may become endemic, but it will be one of, eventually it will be controlled. And we still have to deal with future assaults from nature as well as the disease that I mentioned. I also want to point out that there are other diseases that get very little press, and yet they are tremendously devastating. For example, mycetoma, recognized by the World Health Organization, is a fungal disease of people that is chronic, and it affects millions of people in the world, and yet it is largely ignored in medical research. So if you address this, it is important to know that microbes are just as important for health. We are in a symbiotic state with trillions of microbes that constitute our microbiome. And our association with microbes is essential for aspects of development, nutrition, for example. The microbes in the gut help us to digest food. They also synthesize critical components like vitamin K, and they are just as essential as many of the other things that we need to live. One of the problems in recent years has been the problem of antimicrobial resistance. And I want to say a few words about that because that threatens a lot of the gains that have been made in medicine. So in the 1930s and 40s, antimicrobial agents were discovered. This was another great revolution in medicine because for the first time, physicians could effectively treat a variety of infectious diseases. So the golden era was the 40s to the 60s. Numerous antimicrobial agents were introduced. And this allowed prolonged surgeries to be done. This allowed chemotherapy to be developed because chemotherapy makes cancer patients at risk for infectious diseases. So what has happened is that many of the microbes that have become resistant, some of them have become completely resistant to all antimicrobial drugs. And the problem of antimicrobial resistance is a calamity in medicine because that threatens the progress that has been made in many of the other aspects, surgery, cancer, chronic diseases. And to put this in perspective, infectious disease is the only subspecialty of medicine where things have gotten worse, in the sense that when I trained as an infectious disease fellow, many of the drugs that I could use at the time are no longer effective. There is no other specialty in medicine where drugs look efficacy. Antihypertensive drugs are as effective today as they were 50 years ago. And this is a calamity that is affecting all of medicine, but also has the potential to threaten sustainability because by bringing back a lot of the infectious diseases. So I want to end by emphasizing the need that the microbial world is a source of health and disease. And it is one of the critical challenges is understanding the elements by which it contributes to both. And with that, I will turn it over to, I believe Joe is next, right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Casadevall. I think it's a perfect transition to emphasize how very little we know about the biodiversity of microorganisms, how many opportunities we have to maybe get those gains back again and address important problems like antimicrobial resistance. And no better person to talk about microbial biodiversity than our next panelist, Dr. Joe Handelsman.
Thank you, Dr. Aguirre, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss the roles of microbes in food and food production and the environment with you. The roles of microbes in many processes on land and in food production in particular are often ignored, but we would be wise, based on our long history with them, to pay attention to the microbes that keep us and our environment healthy and functional and keep us fed. My comments today will focus on microorganisms in the entire agroecosystem, which is constituted by the plants, the animals, and of course, the microbes and the soil that sustain our food production. Although microorganisms are all around us, and as Dr. Quesada-Val said, they are diverse in their function and in their type, but no environment on Earth is as rich with microbes as the soil. There are about a few billion bacteria in each gram of soil, or put another way, 1 gram of soil contains as many bacteria as there are people on Earth. And those bacteria are not all the same, which is why we consider the soil the home of most of the diversity on Earth. So when we destroy the soil and its microbes, we destroy biodiversity. Many of the microbes contribute to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and other microbes work against those goals. So here are a few examples. Certain microorganisms produce methane in rice paddies, a growing problem across the world as rice production increases. But there are other microorganisms that reduce the release of methane by eating the methane in the paddies. So if we could harness those microbes, the ones that consume the methane, we would be far better off, and rice production would be far better for the world at large. Similarly, there are microorganisms that live in cows' rumens, and they produce methane as well, making the billion cows on Earth quite significant contributors to climate change. But there are other microbes that can eat methane before it reaches the atmosphere. Once again, can we engineer the cow rumen to have the microbes not produce methane and make cow and livestock production more sustainable? Soil bacteria promote the health of our crops by increasing drought tolerance, protecting the crop plants from disease, and providing nutrients that are necessary for plant growth. But then there are other microorganisms that cause plant disease, and those can reduce yield or even destroy an entire crop, as we've seen with plant epidemics across the world. In the future, I hope we'll see technology that harnesses the power of microbes to increase food production in an environmentally sustainable way, perhaps by replacing pesticides, replacing fertilizers, whose production significantly contributes to agriculture's large carbon footprint. But probably the most familiar part of the agroecosystem that microbes play a critical role in is soil. Soil is the substrate that supports 95% of the food production for the food we consume. And the role of soil goes far beyond food production. The Earth's soil is not only the sustenance for our food supply, but it is also the largest terrestrial reservoir for carbon, containing 3 times as much carbon as there is in the entire atmosphere, 3 times as much as the atmosphere contains. It also contains 4 times as much as all the vegetation on Earth. So whereas the plants and forests are given credit for storing a lot of carbon on Earth, which they do, in fact, it is the soil and the microbes in it that are responsible for a much larger proportion of our carbon. And so we should be protecting the soil and its carbon. That carbon has, in many cases, stably resided in soil for millennia, but instead we're disrupting the soil and causing this precious resource to disappear and causing the microorganisms in it to release the carbon into the atmosphere as greenhouse gases. Many regions of the world have lost half of their topsoil to intensive farming practices. Soil is removed or eroded from the land by water and wind, and it can be deposited either in waterways, other land where it's not useful for agriculture, can even be transported across continents. Billions of tons of soil are transported through wind processes every year across the great oceans to other continents. When it moves to those other places, the soil is no longer useful for food production at its origin, although sometimes it does fertilize the land where it lands. It takes hundreds of years to accumulate 1 centimeter of soil, which is largely by weathering and microbial processes. But the same amount can be lost in a single growing season, or even in some recent years, we've seen particularly violent storms that have removed more than 1 centimeter of soil in one day. And this will worsen as climate change brings more extreme weather conditions in the future. Our dominant farming practices that involve plowing and monocropping are, especially in industrial agriculture, are responsible for most of the soil degradation and loss. And we know full well that other practices preserve and even build soil. So the soil problem is really a good news story. We know exactly what to do to save our soil, and every country should be helping farmers to adopt soil safe practices. Much of the world is losing its soil 10 to 100 times faster than it's produced, which is obviously not sustainable. And in fact, the FAO has predicted that most of the world's soil will run out within 60 years. So how will we produce food without soil? Well, based on current technology, we simply can't. So what can we do to prevent this calamity? The key is to use agricultural practices that build soil carbon, which has two outcomes. First, the carbon enriches and stabilizes the soil, making it more supportive for crop production, more able to hold water, and less likely to erode. But secondly, building stable soil carbon stocks can sequester carbon that would otherwise end up in the atmosphere as greenhouse gases. Since the Industrial Revolution, agriculture has lost 133 billion tons of carbon worldwide. That's just the carbon from soil in agricultural land. If we apply sufficient ingenuity, which humans have shown they have a great talent for, we can harness the capacity of plants coupled with microbes to recapture that carbon and store it in soil in stable forms. And it's important that we talk about stable forms, because if it's simply cycled and lost as greenhouse gases, then it's not doing the atmosphere or the soil much good. So to ensure food production in the future, we absolutely must preserve our soil. And this relates to several of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Obviously, zero hunger, that's the top one, that without soil, we cannot have food production. And we have many more people to feed in the future, in the future of our people. We need clean water. Soil turns out to be the largest water filter in the world. So we pass contaminated water through soil from the surface down to the groundwater, and it comes out clean. That's why we're able to drink water from land that is quite contaminated or polluted at the surface, such as farms, but the soil and the microbes in it purify that water and make it palatable for people. We need to be concerned with the sustainable goal of climate change, because soil carbon can either contribute or mitigate climate change. And we need to make the choice of what we choose to do with our soil. Do we, in fact, use it to mitigate climate change, or do we continue to squander the soil carbon, and contribute to climate change? Sustainable goal number 15 is directly related to the soil. It talks about stopping land degradation and loss of biodiversity. Since soil is home to most of the biodiversity on Earth, we must preserve the soil. That's essential to preserving the Earth's biodiversity. And finally, the Sustainable Development Goal of gender equality is quite critical and essential for protecting our resources. Most of the food in the world is produced on small farms. These are farms of 2 hectares or less. And most of these farms are managed by women. Women have a large role to play in preserving soil and sustaining food production. But many are forced to make choices between feeding their families in the short term and preserving the soil in the long term. We need to empower and support women to make sound choices on their farms. It shouldn't be a choice between feeding children and protecting soil. We must do both. So, actions we can take. First, we need research on soil microbes so that we can develop the technologies to grow soil more quickly and protect plants from disease to increase crop production. We need to learn from our indigenous people on Earth. These are the people who have farmed and managed their soil successfully for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. They know how to keep soil carbon intact and to keep soil from eroding. In return for learning from indigenous people and learning about their practices, which are quite ingenious in many cases, well adapted to their environments, and very obviously effective because their farmland has lasted far longer than most of the world's farmland has lasted. We need to give these indigenous people a voice in global management of resources. Not only do they have the wisdom and the experience of centuries of managing the environment and respecting it in many cases, but they also are the most deeply affected by many of the actions of our state actors, such as climate changes that will differentially and disproportionately affect them. So we need to empower indigenous people to speak and influence the Earth's future and, of course, their own and the rest of our future in the process. We need to change our soil practices to be protective rather than degradative. And we need to increase the stability of soil and the carbon in it by increasing total carbon. And the fourth is very immediate and very important. We all need to join the global community at COP26. This is the climate meeting that is happening in November in Glasgow. And we need to sign, every country should sign on to the 4 per mil agreement that was introduced at COP21 in 2015 by the French minister. The goal of 4 per mil is to increase carbon in the top meter of soil globally across the Earth by 0.4% each year over the next 2 to 3 decades. This will be probably how long it takes to saturate the soil with carbon. This increase will enhance agricultural productivity, reduce vulnerability of the agroecosystem to the weather extremes that are anticipated with climate change. It will help us retain and clean water, and it will reduce net emissions. The amount was very deliberately chosen, the 0.4% increase in carbon, because it is matched to the projections that are of the increase in greenhouse gas emissions that are expected over the next decade. So the idea is to balance the increase in soil in carbon emissions by increasing carbon in soil over the next few decades. We need to just simply implement some fundamental changes to our cropping systems. We need to do less plowing, more intercropping, more composting, and more cover cropping. If every hectare of land in agriculture participated in these major efforts in practices, we would radically change the face of the earth, literally. We would change the soil, we would increase the carbon content, and increase water quality and availability. So I urge all countries to arrive at COP26, including the United States, which has not yet signed on to the agreement, to arrive at COP26 ready to sign on to 4 per mil. We will improve our agricultural system, our environment, and human health and sustainability of our food system. We need to have a plan. When every country returns home from Glasgow in November, each needs to have an action plan to achieve the goal of 4 per mil or increasing soil carbon across the world by 0.4%. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Handelsman, an inspiring talk. I want to just touch upon 2 important points you made: the need to protect the soil and its carbon, but at the same time remediate the losses with developing technologies to recapture the lost carbon in a stable form. And this is a perfect transition again to our next panelist, Dr. Tim Donahue, which I hope is going to give us hope that we are on the right path to do so.
Thank you, Hema. I want to thank ISC for soliciting input today on the scientific advances needed to achieve the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. To give you my bottom lines up front, understanding the many beneficial and detrimental activities of microbes is required to achieving these goals. And second, investment in international research collaborations to understand the role of microbes is needed to decarbonize our industries and economies, limit climate change, and provide energy, economic, and social justice in the future. To illustrate the role of microbes, I want to provide a few examples. Billions of years ago, microbes provided the planet with oxygen for the first time that we and other organisms need to breathe. Today, microbes are still the master chemists of the planet. They have been performing many important chemical transformations longer than people. They play key roles in carbon cycling, nitrogen, oxygen, metal cycling, and the transformations of a variety of compounds, too numerous to mention. They are the most abundant organisms on Earth. Without them, the planet simply could not support life as we know it. Many of our other activities depend on microbes. They produce foods. They are associated with every plant and animal, and they inhabit every corner of the planet, including inhospitable places like permafrost, the deserts, and they live at extreme pressures underground and beneath the oceans. For these reasons and more, research investments are needed to understand the numerous positive and negative roles of microbes to the planet and its inhabitants. I want to illustrate this with two specific examples. The first is that microbes can reduce the energy inputs, carbon loss, and greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Professor Handelsman just spoke on the positive roles of microbes in agriculture. It is also true that agricultural practices, some of them at least, have large energy and environmental inputs. These inputs include the fuel needed for planting and irrigation and fertilization, the energy needed to synthesize fertilizer, pesticides, lime, and other compounds that are put on the field, and as Joe just talked about, the loss of soil carbon from long-term land use. Remember that agriculture is a major source of the greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. The 2018 IPCC report states that all of the successful models to reduce global warming require significant changes to agricultural practices. To achieve these changes, we need to obtain scientific knowledge to promote microbial soil activities that allow us to reduce the use of energy-intensive chemicals like fertilizer. Use microbes to help plants restore soil carbon. Increase carbon storage by microbes both on land, as Joe mentioned, but on water as well. And engineer microbes to reduce the negative impacts of fertilizer, phosphorus, and pesticide release into the environment. The IPCC models predict that these changes to agricultural practices are needed to lower net carbon dioxide emissions. And I also want to remind us that emissions and pollutants have no borders, so these reductions will positively impact all members of the planet. In sum, we need international investment and cooperation to develop microbes that improve the energy, economic, and environmental sustainability of agricultural processes. In my second example, I will highlight the benefits of harnessing the power of microbes to convert renewable resources into electricity, fuels, and chemicals. Today, petroleum is used to provide electricity, fuels, and chemicals in many regions of the globe. The economic benefits of the petroleum industry, however, are limited to a few countries that own or refine fossil fuels, and the negative environmental impacts of this practice are global. In the US, at least, the US Energy Information Administration estimated that half of the country's energy-related CO2 emissions in 2020 came from petroleum use. As we look to the future, advances in genomics have paved the way for something that I and others are calling a green bioeconomy. In this green bioeconomy, microbes will be generating electricity, fuels, chemicals, and other products. The raw materials for this bioeconomy include non-edible plant material, as well as animal, dairy, and municipal waste. Deploying microbes to support a green economy will require advances in genomics, systems, and synthetic biology, computational sciences, machine learning, and techno-economic analyses. These new microbial catalysts can increase the productivity, quality, and products produced from agriculture, provide clean air, water, and a higher standard of living, convert renewable materials into drugs, medical reagents, materials, and next-generation antibiotics. As examples, researchers have already developed methods to convert renewable materials into hydrocarbon fuels, lubricants, precursors for plastics, an organic fungicide with uses in agriculture and other arenas, and acetaminophen, the active ingredient in Tylenol and other commercial painkillers, which is currently generated from coal tar. In my opinion, the time is ripe for international collaboration to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Strategic investment in microbial systems can help us lower greenhouse gas emission, generate uses, productive, profitable uses for abundant raw materials, develop microbes that convert renewables into low carbon and low cost electricity, fuels, chemicals, and materials, spawn a circular economy that recycles abundant materials, develop microbial scrubbers to remove pollutants from soil, groundwater, and other contaminated sites, bring jobs and economic opportunities to new regions of the world, and improve health, medicine, agriculture, and safeguard the environment for the future. We have all seen or experienced disruptions to power, fuels, chemicals, medicines, and other essential services caused by weather, disease, and now a global pandemic. Plugging microbes into a clean energy future around the world will provide a distributed and sustainable supply chain that is secure, resilient, and able to respond to the ever-evolving needs of its citizens around the globe. The benefits of past international collaboration in science include the global initiative to sequence the human genome in the 20th century. I would submit this is an excellent example of what we should be doing to meet the Sustainable Development Goals moving forward. This investment alone in the Human Genome Project created many of the scientific advances that will be needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. In closing, I want to mention again that meeting these goals will require a large, diverse, and collaborative workforce that includes field, laboratory, and computational researchers. However, it will also require contributions from farmers, laborers, policymakers, technology developers, and educators who inspire the future leaders in these areas. As a proud parent of a graduate student and a university employee, I know that tomorrow's scientists want to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. On their behalf, I want to again thank ISC for your interest in research and the invitation to speak. I and others on this panel stand ready to help you and the microbes advance a bold international initiative to achieve your goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Donahue, and thank you for ending in that hopeful note. You brought up the need to address economic and environmental sustainability with a diverse and collaborative workforce. Is a perfect way to move to our last speaker, our last panelist, Dr. Gretchen Diaz Munoz. Maybe we have her muted and that's why we don't hear her.
Yeah, here I am. Greetings from Puerto Rico. Thank you, Gemma. After listening to my colleagues discussing evidence about the crucial role of microbes and microbial sciences in our societies and the planet, I would like to mention several points about the importance of a different type of diversity in STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and math. And why should we care about diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM? First of all, STEM disciplines play an extremely important role in the fulfillment of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations. Through STEM, we can find solutions to the great challenges that humanity faces and will face. If we are to confront such daunting problems, we must first build a global infrastructure that is welcoming of every talent, every experience, concerns, and perspective, regardless of gender, race, creed, sexual orientation, physical ability, and every other unique attribute and identity that an individual may carry. Sometimes the problem is that rather than leveraging those skills to the collective benefit, we often allow differences to impede progress and innovation. And one of the keys to sustainable change and innovative discovery is diversity. And if we fail at engaging and harnessing the power of diversity, then we will fail at these ambitious goals that we have for the world. So what is the situation? Well, one of the biggest problems around the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion is the lack of data. In many instances, it is because the necessary questions are not being asked to determine the status of certain populations. For example, in the United States, data on LGBTQ+ individuals in STEM is still limited because surveys of the National Center for Science, Engineering, Statistics on the STEM workforce currently don't ask about sexual or gender identity, which is a huge problem to start. And that brings me to the subject on which I would like to emphasize my remarks, which is gender equity in STEM. I'll give you just a few statistics. For example, in the US, since 2005, women have received more PhD degrees in life sciences than men, but fewer women than men progress through the academic ranks, most prominently at the full professor level. More recently, in 2015, women represented half of the US college-educated people in science and engineering, but they only represent 28% of the workers in these occupations. And if we talk about Latina women in the US, it's about 2%. But globally, the most recent numbers from UNESCO indicate that less than 30% of researchers are women. In North America and Europe, it ranges from 32 to 39%, while in Central Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, they are doing a little bit better, with range from 45 to 48%. However, overall, women are underrepresented in disciplines such as math, physics, computer and data sciences, and engineering, among others. These are just some numbers of the many data examples emphasizing the gender inequality and inequity that plagues the various fields of education and discovery around the globe. I think it is important to note that the problems faced by women in STEM globally may vary by region and specifically by country, but there are a wide variety of problems faced by girls and women in STEM that have been described. These issues occur from school to college and the workplace. For example, in some countries, girls have limited access to quality education, while in others, they demonstrate a strong interest in getting a job in their future that allows them to help others or help their society. And what better than STEM disciplines to do that? However, the majority of them do not choose these disciplines when they decide their majors. So stereotypes that exist about STEM disciplines and those who practice are usually attributed to this behavior, which translates into a lack of interest in them. On the other side, countries that graduate a large number of women in STEM, such as the US, present other issues such as sexual harassment in the academia and work. A report from the US National Academies in 2018 found that between 20 to 50% of female students and more than 50% of female faculty and staff in higher education institutions experience some kind of sexually harassing behavior of all types. The report also highlights several factors that increase the likelihood of women being targeted for sexual harassment. And these are perception of institutional tolerance of inappropriate behavior, a male-dominated environment, the hierarchical relationship between faculty and trainees, and the necessity of conducting research in isolated environments. The evidence suggests that these are all substantial factors in why women leave the STEM workforce. Also, work environments can be particularly hostile for women of underrepresented populations in many countries, who are more likely to face sexual harassment and job stress when they have to work harder to prove that they belong. Women in STEM jobs are more likely than women in non-STEM jobs to say that they have experienced some sort of discrimination at work. In developing countries, there's another level of complexity related to the poor educational and work infrastructure, as well as the little attention to STEM research. And that then brings me to some of the opportunities that we have. Starting precisely with developing countries, which face greater vulnerability to issues like disease, pandemics, sanitation, housing, food security, and obviously climate change. There's a huge opportunity by training more women in STEM to address these issues and have a great impact in their countries and the world. As Joe mentioned before, it doesn't have to be a choice, but women have to be involved. Also, we are living in the fourth industrial revolution, and this is a revolution that demands more STEM professionals, and it's clear that a significant increase in the number of women entering and remaining in STEM careers is necessary more than ever, especially because women are users of many of the services and technologies that are being produced by this revolution. And also, and very important, because many of the jobs that will be lost as a result of the emergence of new technologies are currently carried out by women. I would like to emphasize the important role that professional societies like ASM can have by facilitating the discussion and advocacy of policies that move forward gender equity in science. Moreover, professional societies can help to move the needle and increase women inclusion in STEM. There's a recent editorial about the role of the Organization for Women in Science for a Developing World. And they highlighted 4 fundamental categories recommended to map out an effective strategy to increase participation in science. First, to create community of support. Second, to provide mobility for training and experiences. Third, to create capacity and promote retention. And finally, to give visibility to these women and their contributions so that they can serve as role models for future pioneers. I strongly believe that they are key to move that needle, not only at developing countries, but globally. So to finish, what is our call? I think it's evident that there are barriers stacked against girls and women to succeed and flourish in STEM. It is essential that we work to remove these barriers and eradicate the components that are permitting the perpetuation of gender discrimination in academic and work environments. So to do this, we must first collect data. This is very important. I have to emphasize on this because every country needs to know their situation for girls and women in STEM. And not having appropriate and quality data is a huge problem to address these issues. We must address effective policies, procedures, and practice for gender equity, and we must work to remove all these barriers. Addressing issues of equity, inclusion, and diversity requires immediate action, and it is in our sight. Thank you very much for your time and this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diaz-Munoz. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm fired up, and I'm just looking that we only have 4 minutes, and I wish I didn't have to go and teach my students microbial genetics, and I could stay with you forever. We don't see any questions in the chat, and because of the lack of time, I'm going to ask a question to each of you. I think it's very clear how intertwined water, food, health, energy, sustainability issues are, and the need, and I'm going to quote Dr. Diaz, the need to create global infrastructure that is welcoming of every talent. What a wonderful quote. So with that, I would ask each of you, and we'll follow the same order of the talks, if you had to pick just one priority area to put into the next United Nations agenda, what would it be? Let's start with Dr. Casadeval. Just one.
So the one priority area will be to map the microbial world. We need to know what's out there, period. This is remarkably how little we know. So my priority will be to know the microbial world in this planet.
Fantastic. Yeah, we have to learn to understand, to manipulate. Dr. Handelsman, you brought so many important issues. You have to pick one.
Okay, well, I would pick an inclusive one, and that would be protection of soil worldwide and development of a coalition of countries worldwide to preserve soil. But embedded in that must be paying attention to diversity of players. We can't just have decisions made by the same state actors that have done a lot of the damage that's been done to our environment in the past. We need to include diverse voices.
Fantastic. Dr. Donahue, one.
So I would say we need to bring all players to the table to move forward on these goals. So they can understand and appreciate the benefits and limitations of science and how we can work together to affect change to leave a planet for future generations that then is better than the one we're heading towards.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. And Dr. Diaz Munoz, every problem, only one priority area.
Yeah, I think one thing that is vital for advanced science is that inclusion topic. And I think for that, we need to do a better effort globally in how to know better the situation of women and girls in STEM. And we have statistics and numbers that are very fragmented. Not all the countries have the resources to do this. And I think we have to do a global strategy to know better what is happening in order to make a solution for this.
Yes, and I would also add something that you brought up, that we do have the data. We no longer can use that as an excuse for other underrepresented groups. We may not have the data and we'll need to collect it, but gender equality is something that we do have the data and the solutions. We only have 1 minute, so I'm going to close the panel just by thanking them. I'm so inspired and fired up. I do want to close with some remarks that you all mentioned, and if they need to diversify the science and the scientists. I think Dr. Donahue brought the comment, bring all the players to the table. I would also say give all the players equal opportunities in those discussions so we can all make global changes and all will benefit from that. It's exactly 10 a.m. I know we all have to rush, but it was a pleasure to have you all. Thank you again to the organizers and to these wonderful panelists. It was a privilege to be able to moderate the panel. And let me see if I can find the applause, since this is virtual, but an applause to all of them. You were fantastic, and many, many thanks.